Alright, we got the worst death ever discovered in prehistoric time.
State the fact that humans as a
prehistoric
whole
human.
have experienced an abundance of pain, which might not be that surprising considering that pain pretty much comes with the territory of life. But in some areas, one can argue that we've experienced more than other animals thanks to our very own creativity, let's say. And this problem of suffering and misery is not just exclusive to we modern humans, but rather extends to all humans, i.e., all species that belong to the genus Homo, who have sadly been lost
But
along the
imagine
way.
living in the year
And while
before
no one
Jesus
can fully
Christ,
agree
bro.
on the amount, it appears that the
Man,
number of
I'm
Homo
glad to be living
species
the modern
who've ever
era, bro.
existed sits at around 14, all of who, minus us, have popped up and then disappeared within the last 2.8 million years or so. Now we, Homo sapiens, have been around for about 300,000 of those years, which in a general sense can seem long, but when you compare it to the whole 3 million years of the Homo genus, then you suddenly realize that it's really not. And when you think about just how long 3 million years is, you can start to imagine how much different the world of our ancient ancestors and cousins was compared to ours, which
Man.
in turn means different experiences,
I ain't gonna lie, we
different
gotta be
pains,
easy, bro.
and different deaths, some of which can literally not be recreated today. And not
Imagine
just
going
because
outside, you
they
have
no longer
90%
exist,
chance of
but
dying, bro.
sometimes because they involve unbreakable achievements, as seen with this first specimen, who is for now the oldest known murder victim ever. This skull may look a bit like yours or mine, but it isn't, as it doesn't belong to a sapien, but rather a Homo heidelbergensis, a species or subspecies of archaic humans that existed during the Middle Pleistocene. And if it wasn't obvious, this particular individual has, or had, a major problem, and actually two, those being the giant holes in their head. It was clear to researchers who found this unfortunate fellow in a Spanish cave that the holes are what had killed them, and would have done so pretty quickly, causing a catastrophic head and brain injury. The only question is, though, what caused them? Given that caves are sloped, and in many cases have plenty of sharp points, scientists first thought that a fall had taken out this heidelbergensis, during which a sharp rock had pierced his noggin. But if that actually was the case, you would not expect there to be two identical holes, and thus making the scenario unlikely. The next assumption was that it might have been an animal, but the problem with that is that there's no animal in Spain during the time that made anything remotely similar to such injuries. Which then led to the
Well,
last
maybe you just didn't
hypothesis,
find them, bro.
as there was one thing that it did resemble quite a bit, something that the anthropologists are all too familiar with, and that's injuries from human tools. Specifically, the marks looked a lot like those seen from stone axes, which can cause severe blunt force trauma, and suggesting that this person had been murdered. And given that
Okay,
they
I
were
see.
done
It makes
in
sense. It
about
makes sense, actually.
430,000 years ago or so,
Just like in
they
Far
are
Cry
considered
Primal, bro.
the oldest case of murder or homicide so far.
When they
and
were killing
demonstrate
each
that
other and
violence
shit.
may have been a part of our history before we even existed. And surprise, surprise, it also turns out that this heidelbergensis was not alone in death, as thousands of other Homo bones were found in the cave too, with a few of them showing signs of having been domed as well. Yet none were as old as this particular specimen. And the current belief is that this cave may have been the oldest examples of a designated burial site, where people who died from virtually anything were tossed into, be it a violent death or not. And in the case of our poor friend, this early violence could have been the result of a fight over resources or territory.
She was so
resulting in
fucking
him
violent
cutting
back in the
off
day,
head.
bro.
So overall, not a great way to go, but arguably much better than what happened to this guy, who was dubbed OH7. Now OH7 was not a heidelbergensis, but rather a Homo habilis, one of the oldest human species which lived in South and East Africa. And in addition to being one of the oldest, they were also one of the smallest humans ever, with individuals only being around 4 feet or 1.2 meters tall, resulting in them being very, very fragile, and making life challenging for them from the get-go. But in the case of OH7, life, or rather death, wasn't just challenging, it was downright unfair, and is another case of a death that is no longer possible. And not because he holds any first-time achievements, but instead because he was killed by something, or some things, which no longer exist. Extinct animals. This individual in life would have lived in an ancient wetland area, where a variety of predators thrived. But
Man.
it seems that one day, while out for a drink, he was attacked by one of the worst things you could possibly run into. A crocodile, and a giant one at that. And not just any old giant crocodile, but rather the largest true crocodile species to have ever lived.
Really?
The Crocodylus thorbjornarsoni, a now extinct
Crocodylus.
species which could crack 7.6 meters or 25 feet in length while weighing over 2 tons. So in other words, a very unfair matchup.
Oh, what
for a
the
little
fuck?
relative. Based
Bro,
on
what
the
kind of
release,
matchmaking is
it
this,
appears that the
bro?
crocodile had ambushed OH7.
I ain't got their
who
servers
managed
were
to quickly
crazy,
turn
bro.
away, but was caught at the last second, as his left leg bore massive puncture marks. There were also parts of his leg that were completely missing, implying that it had been torn clean off in the attack, which in a hot mucky wetland was basically a death sentence, even if you didn't bleed out. And yet, Mother Nature still deemed this not to be punishment enough, as in one of the rarest cases known, it seems that he was then attacked by a second, completely different predator, a feline, specifically a leopard-sized one. Now, this doesn't
Yo,
necessarily
those ones were
mean
so
he was
annoying in Far
expecting a
Cry 6,
leopard
bro. I
to
mean,
be a
Primal.
tag team duo, but whatever did attack him, attacked the back of his head, leaving long grooves in his parietal bone. This does
Damn.
align with a leopard's hunting strategy, or at least a closely related Panthera species.
Imagine the
And
pain,
just
bro.
so it wasn't clear, OH7 unfortunately died, as both marks on his head and leg showed absolutely no signs of healing. Now, I will say, it is technically possible that he died first from the crocodile attack and then got picked apart by a feline, but because the croc only took one leg, and because the damage from the feline was in a spot that is associated with predatory behavior, some think it really was a dual attack. And it's hypothesized that after getting attacked by the croc, he may have turned to face it while trying to fight back, leaving his back wide open to a nearby feline, and thus spelling his doom. And for what it's worth, even today, on multiple occasions, crocs and felines have been observed fighting over an animal. However, thankfully, the animals
Interesting,
involved
I didn't know
today do
that.
not include an extinct feline and a massive, never-again-seen-sized crocodile. So this death surely must have sucked. But remember, it's not always the violent demises.
Double teaming against a weaker opponent is crazy, bro.
This is
That's the violation.
KNMR1808, a 1.7 million-year-old Homo erectus from Kenya who had a troubled history with A. Not the letter, but the vitamin, vitamin A, which, while being an essential vitamin, can be harmful in large amounts. And too much of it is what apparently killed our Homo erectus friend over 1 million years ago. And trust me, that's not a good way to go. Her partial skeleton was first located back in 1974, and scientists immediately noted there was something wrong with it, as her bones showed abnormal growth patterns, namely excess bone turnover, and held evidence of long-term massive bleeding. And yet, there were no clear wounds. And while this may sound perplexing and mysterious, it was actually quite straightforward to the researchers, as the bone growths were consistent with what's seen in hypervitaminosis A, aka vitamin A toxicity, a condition that is well known in both ancient and modern times, with this erectus so far being the oldest example of the disease within humans. The patterns in her bones suggest that this was a condition that she dealt with chronically, and is what ultimately killed her, despite it not usually being a very dangerous condition in modern times. And presumably, given the lack of medical awareness back then, she was taking in too much without knowing it, which on top of her bone problems would have caused symptoms such as weakness, headaches, sloughing off of skin, the loss of hair and teeth, and a lot of joint pain, which is reflected by her limbs bearing the most pathological bone growth. And it was likely over a long duration of time that she had these problems, which thus begs the question, where did she get all this vitamin A?
Looks like somebody
The answer
auntie,
is
bro.
that all signs point to one key suspect: carnivore liver, a well-known source of vitamin A. And in some predators of today, like the polar bear, the liver can store so much of it that it could theoretically supply a human with nearly 150 years worth of the vitamin. And naturally,
What?
not knowing this probably played a big role in her undoing. Now, while likely not as painful as this ending, another prehistoric death that
But
definitely
imagine
sucks,
tomorrow you wake up
simply
and you're
building
living
on
at
how
those
scary
time,
it
bro.
sounds, is what happened to the Tong
Shit,
Child's
God not
200
gonna save you,
million years
buddy.
ago. In
I'm
today's
just
day and
saying.
age, if we find ourselves scared by something outside, it usually results in us frantically looking around us, or if in the water, beneath us, but never really up in the sky. And yet, a long time ago, you might have needed to, as large predatory birds prowled the skies and terrorized the lands of
So,
Africa, and were not afraid to
man.
take a stab at the occasional human.
What kind of
Rather
service is this,
which in
bro?
this case was a seriously unlucky Australopithecus. And despite this
I
break
feel
from the
bad,
home rule,
man.
because again it's Australopithecus, I am including it given the sheer uniqueness of the case. As the Tong
It's
child
like you
was found
die
to
if you
have
don't go
injuries
out,
to
you
his
don't
face
go
and head,
explore
including
because you
puncture
need to
marks in the
eat,
bottom eye sockets,
but you will die
and the top of
anyway
his
though.
cranium was deeply
That's
sunk.
insane.
And interestingly enough, such injuries are actually fairly identical to what's seen in monkeys today that have fallen prey to eagles, suggesting that a large bird had sunk its beak and talons into the Tong child's eyes and head, likely killing him rather quickly, or at least hopefully, before he was then hauled off to be consumed. But the story does not end here, as his death spawned a new mystery. You see, the Tong child is really just a skull, meaning that the body was never found. And what's more, is that it was located in a remote part of the Kalahari Desert, in a cave, where no other bones were found, be it human or other animals, and thus leading researchers to ask how the skull ended up here, of all places. And this has led to a second hypothesis regarding the specimen, where in death, It, or rather its skeleton, had been used by its attackers to build a nest, before the head eventually became dislodged and tumbled down, which by sheer coincidence ended up rolling into a nearby cave where it would then lie for millions of years before being unearthed once more. So, with all this said, I bet you'll never look at birds the same way again. But something you're probably already weary of is water. While necessary to life, it can also cause extreme discomfort, to say the least. And drowning is often ranked as one of the worst ways to go, which is seriously misfortunate, as this might have befell on possibly the entire Homo erectus species, or at least what was left of them. The erectus were one of the most successful human species of all time, and actually the longest lived, having been the first Homo to not only leave Africa, but also colonize Europe and Asia, where in the latter they would make their final stand. And as far as we know, the youngest erectus fossils ever, dating to about 110,000 years ago, came from the island of Java, and strangely enough, all of them perished in a mass death event. To be exact, nearly 100 years ago, a research team on the island stumbled upon a graveyard of over a dozen erectus specimens, who were all adults and were mangled together in one spot. And given the lack of evidence for disease, physical wounds, or old age, it was presumed that they all had died at the same time from one thing. But the question is, what exactly could have done it? Well, based on the type of sediment in which they were found, it was concluded that a flood was possibly a part of the answer, with the belief being that all the bodies had been swept away by floodwaters down to a narrowing river, where they then ended up getting trapped in a logjam, thus forming a kind of carcass jam, I guess, which eventually fossilized. But this does not necessarily mean that they were killed in said flood, but rather they were just swept away by it at some point. However, for now, it is still believed that a mass drowning was behind the actual deaths. And one more narrowed down idea is the belief that a volcanic eruption in particular was their undoing, as it potentially caused lahar flows, which are cold and hot mixtures of rock and water that run down the slope of a volcano, wreaking havoc and typically overflowing rivers. And we know from modern times that such events can cause widespread local devastation, traveling more than 60 miles and in some cases killing tens of thousands of people. And if a volcanic lahar really was the perpetrator in killing the last erectus, then it would be one of the only fossils that we know of that truly shows an extinction event in process. Though it should be mentioned that volcanic eruptions or mass flooding were not the reason why erectus died out in general, with the main belief being that in Java, the last populations started to wither after its woodland biome started to change into a rainforest. Additionally, it is of course possible, and even probable, that younger remains of erectus are out there too. It's just that for now, these fossils represent the final known members, making the whole thing just that much more tragic, yet also poetic. Unfortunately, there's nothing poetic with this next case though, which was just brutal, as it involves one of the worst animals to be taken out by, a hyena, who are known to eat their
Man,
victims
those
alive
cowards,
and
bro.
utilize horrific bite and pull methods.
They always running in
Once
gangs
used
and
to the
shit.
victim. Very painful, to say the least. And the hyenas I'm talking about weren't just some modern ones that you'd find on a safari.
Yeah,
but
they're
rather
worst.
a now extinct giant one, the Pachycrocuta, who is among the largest hyenas to ever live, with adults sometimes breaking 150 kilograms.
Imagine they were
or
still like this in
330
the
pounds,
2025,
making them rivals
bro.
to lionesses when it comes to size. And to make matters worse, their weight was not distributed like that of a lion, as they had proportionally massive heads, with massive indentations indicative of powerful muscles, which resulted in them biting down with monstrous forces, allowing them to do things like this. This is a multi-100,000-year-old erectus skull that was absolutely obliterated by a Pachycrocuta. And it wasn't alone, as this is actually just one of the more than 28 specimens found in the Zhaokutian Peking Man site in China, who met very grisly ends, presumably. You may have heard of the Peking Man before, a claimed subspecies of erectus who were found within a cave, but you probably didn't know that of the 28 plus specimens, approximately 67% had bite marks which are thought to have come from the Pachycrocuta. And bites is putting it lightly, as multiple erectus body parts have been found that can only be described as smashed or obliterated.
Yo, we're making
likely
those
through
names
attempts
of
by the hyenas
Pachycrocuta,
to
bro.
access the nutritious bone marrow
Bro.
within, or perhaps just to eat the entire parts of the bone whole. And considering the state of the skeletons, I'd say they were rather successful. Back in the day, given the sheer insanity of the damage, and because man-made tools were also found, it was first thought that the Peking Man had inhabited this cave, and these specimens were rather evidence for cannibalistic murders. However, upon further analyzing all the bones, including the non-human ones, it became clear that at least to some degree, hyenas had been behind this symphony of death, with the current idea being
They
that
can
this
swim
cave
too?
actually represented a Pachycrocuta den, but at various points after abandonment was also used by mankind, thus explaining the tools. And besides showcasing just how horrifying hyena attacks were, the site has also served as a reminder not to take our apex predator status for granted. Because while erectus were major predators for many animals, and even contested with carnivores, it seems that in prehistoric China, they were still not at the top of the totem pole, with that spot going to our giant hyenas. Which especially seems to be the case when considering that many human bones have been found with Pachycrocuta damage, while the opposite cannot be said. And let's face it, there's not much you can do against lion-sized hyenas, even if you did have a spear. And for what it's worth, there's also the hypothesis that hyenas themselves were for a long time the literal reason why humans were not able to expand into certain areas. And even beyond the Pachycrocuta, we know many instances where a hyena took a nip out of a human, including in modern times, as they are sometimes known to become man-eaters. So that's all to say, it really makes me grateful that we at least do not have to worry about giant horns.
Yeah, I'm glad to be born in the 2000, bro.
Is not having a toothbrush. Now that probably doesn't seem like a big deal, but tell that to the Trichinoboy, or KNMWT 15000, another Homo erectus specimen, as they just really didn't seem to be able to catch a break. But unlike the Peking man, this specimen did not live in Asia, but rather in Kenya.
Yeah, I thought this was a 10-minute video at first. That it was like 20.
And 1.5 million years ago. At the time, the erectus had already invented some pretty nifty tools, and might have even a control of fire, or at least partially. Yet, what they did not seem to have unlocked just yet was good dental hygiene, as the Trichinoboy did not have any major catastrophic wounds, but instead an interesting pathology in his mouth. To be precise, he showed signs of having formed a nasty abscess after his milk teeth had fallen out and his molars and premolars had come in awkwardly, resulting in the two teeth colliding and damaging the tissues, which ultimately gave way to infection and an abscess that never healed, highly implying that he died from it, and at a young age, as the fallen teeth were baby teeth, and it's thought that he succumbed around the age of 8 or 9. And based on what we know about present-day tooth infections, it's thought that septicemia is likely what did him in, a nasty condition that occurs when bacteria or their toxins cause blood poisoning, aka sepsis, which even today is quite challenging to treat, and back then was almost certainly a death sentence, as it was in his case as well. Based on the location of where he was found, it's presumed that at some point during his sickness, he fell face first while traversing swampy land, unable to get up due to being already weakened by his ailment, and then ultimately died floating face down in swampy waters. And sometimes it really does seem like the universe has it out for certain people, as he couldn't even die in peace, with some researchers believing that not so long after his death, a herd of animals trampled his body.
Okay, come on, bro. This is gotta be made up. This is too much, bro. Come on, bro.
Sometime later on, a part of his skeleton would end up getting sandwiched in between volcanic ash from a local eruption, solidifying his remains further and creating a tomb that would last for over 1 million years. And according to some researchers, all these woes were not even the end of the list, as once upon a time, it was thought that the Trichinoboy suffered from a congenital condition such as dwarfism or scoliosis, as his ribs seemed to be out of place relative to his spine. But over the years, as technology has improved, it has turned out this may not actually be the case. And during the reanalysis, they made a new discovery, which found that while he might not have suffered from dwarfism or scoliosis, he definitely had suffered from a severely herniated disc that was so out of place that, given the lack of technology back then, might have been a double Grim Reaper, so to speak. In other words, if his mouth infection didn't get him, then his herniated disc would have, causing him to have very little mobility and in no condition to fight off any sort of predator. Which all just goes to make you realize that a lot of first world ailments today used to be death sentences back then. Talk about an eye-opener. Thanks for watching, and until next time, on